Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, we're going to be talking about divine hiddenness, and I came across a paper that I must say this is one of my favorite papers that to date that I've read about the topic of divine hiddenness. It's called Two Solutions to the Problem of Divine Hiddenness, and it's by Andrew Cullison. So, hey there, Dr. Cullison.
Hey, Jordan, how you doing?
Thank you so much for coming on. I'm doing well, by the way. Let me give a little bit of a background here. So, a few months ago, I interviewed Daniel Speak. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but he's done some work on free will. But he also wrote this little book on the problem of evil, and one of the chapters in that book was on the problem of divine hiddenness. So I interviewed him on the whole book. We did a whole video just on divine hiddenness, and he laid out like several solutions. It was a very kind of general presentation of here's some ways that theists have responded to the problem of divine hiddenness. He only touched on it for maybe a couple of minutes, it seemed. It was so short, but he gave a response that you give in this paper, and I immediately was like, wow, that's a really interesting response. I've never thought of that. And I thought I need to do an interview just on that response to hear more of it. So I'm hoping that comes out here tonight. So, but the good thing is you not only give that response, which we'll get into first, you give an additional one. And I thought the additional one was so cool too. So both of these responses are very neat and interesting to think about. I guess first question for you is just, how did you get interested in the problem of divine hiddenness?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think, I taught philosophy of religion for many, many years. And, when it comes to like arguments against the existence of God, at least when I was in college, most of it was all focused on problem of evil, variants of the problem of evil. And to be honest, I think I just stumbled on this argument. I stumbled on the Schellenberg paper just in terms of my research. And I was like, well, that's interesting. This is, and it struck me as importantly different from traditional kinds of problem of evil. It also invoked this concept of epistemic rationality. And my background is actually as much in epistemology, theory of knowledge, theory of rational belief. And so I was kind of like, ooh, there's an interesting way in which the concept of epistemic rationality, I think that's kind of what drew me. I was like, okay, I got to see what this is about. And so I think that's sort of how I initially got into it, was just happenstance. And so I started teaching it. I started teaching some of the other responses. And then it just, that's kind of where the idea, I was like, oh, there's better responses than this. And so that's, but it took me a few years to get to them. I taught the paper for a few years.
All right. So I guess first thing we need to do is lay out the main argument. So I actually have a slide, and if you want, just walk us through this main argument, and you can say something more about each step if you'd like.
Yeah. So, this argument, to me, is actually, that is his main argument, that if God exists, no one's going to be epistemically rational for not believing in God. And I don't know what your viewership is like, but maybe I should say a little bit about that term. So
sure, yeah.
Epistemically rational, that's a term of art in philosophy and epistemology. But basically what it means is that no one would be appropriately responsive to their evidence when it comes to not believing in God. So if someone's epistemically irrational, imagine that person who has all the evidence that you think is necessary to make it reasonable to believe that thing, and yet they're still not believing it, and you get it in your head like there's something wrong with them, right? They're not being appropriately responsive to the evidence. We would call them epistemically irrational. And so the idea is, what Schellenberg is saying, if God exists, then maybe there are people who don't believe in God, but it should be their fault, right? Like they should be culpable for it, right? And then he looks around and he's like, look, there are a lot of reasonable people who just don't think the evidence is there to believe in God. There's nothing wrong with them. They're not like cognitively deficient for not believing in God. It's not like the evidence is staring them in the face and they're resistant. It's just like, look, I look around and I don't see anything. I don't see anything that gives me evidence. What's wrong with withholding belief? Now, that's his core argument, but the real heavy lifting comes in with that first premise, trying to articulate why someone should think that first premise is true. And so the first part of my paper, we try to unpack that.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good short presentation of the argument. And the conclusion is obviously God doesn't exist. So
Right.
theists, at least if they want to be rational, are going to want to try and figure out some type of response to this. And again, for the viewers, I'll encourage you, if you want to hear several responses that have been offered, go check out that interview with Dan Speak. But before we get into this first one, let's focus on what justification Schellenberg gives for the very first premise. And you lay out an argument for the first premise in your paper.
Yeah, and I wrote this paper
this
about
argument.
12 years ago, and this is a bit of a word salad, but I can walk people through the basics. The first premise one is basically the idea that the greatest good, if God exists, has to be a personal relationship with God. I mean, come on, he's God, right? Like, what could be better than that? So that's the sort of the first part. And so if that's true, then you would think, this is premise two, you would think that if God exists, he'd do whatever's necessary to make sure that that comes about, right? If that's the greatest good for each individual, then he'd do what's necessary to make sure people enter into that. And so, sub-conclusion, if God exists, there's going to be somebody to do what's necessary to make sure everybody enters into that relationship. Now, P4 is like the real crux of the argument, I think. Well, P1 is too. We can talk about that later. But P4, this is the big one. If there's a being who would do what's necessary, then there's a being, what's necessary for everyone to enter into a personal relationship. Then there's a being who makes sure that everyone has sufficient evidence to believe there's a God. This is the really important premise. And there's an assumption in there. And fortunately for the readers of the paper, I don't go and unpack another sub-argument. But the assumption behind P4 is you absolutely cannot have a personal relationship with someone unless you believe they exist. That's like the most important, crucial piece of this argument, at least in my opinion. And so once you buy that, it all drops out. So if there's a person who makes sure everyone has sufficient evidence to believe there is a God, then there'd be no one who's epistemically rational for not believing in God. Remember how I tried to define that term? Epistemically rational means that it's okay for you to not believe it. There's nothing cognitively wrong with you if you don't believe in God. And the idea is sufficient evidence would mean if everybody had sufficient evidence, the only explanation for why you're not believing is there's something cognitively wrong with you. It's your fault that you're not believing in God. It's not God's fault. God's giving you all the evidence. And so if God exists, then there's no one who would be epistemically rational for not believing in God. And again, that P4, that first premise, and P4, the fourth premise, and P1 are doing a lot of the heavy lifting there.
Okay, so this first response that you give to Schellenberg's argument focuses in on P4. And my understanding, like you just said, that the basic like defense of P4, maybe you could develop it even more, but the rough idea is, well, you can't have a relationship with someone that you don't believe exists. That's essentially the idea behind P4.
Yep, that's exactly right.
So, but that assumption is exactly what you're going to inspect. And
that to me, that's the suspect move.
Okay, so why don't you go ahead and give, in the paper, you give these kind of thought experiments that are going to press on that assumption. So why don't you go ahead and give us one of these thought experiments?
Yeah, so the first one is one that we called a Turing Chat Room. So you imagine that you got a guy named Bob, and he's real lonely, and he begins a chat room relationship with someone, we'll call her Julie. They're both grieving the loss of a loved one. She's offering words of encouragement. I want to storify this because I want it to be believable that it's a personal relationship. So, she's offering words of encouragement. Bob does the same for Julie. Then Bob's friend Steve provides Bob with overwhelming evidence that chat rooms have very sophisticated Turing machine type programs, so they can mimic human interaction. And by the way, this has gotten way more plausible than when I wrote this paper 15 years ago. So this strikes me as a more salient example because the AI and the machine learning has gotten way more sophisticated. So he's nervous. He thinks it's highly likely that Julie's a fake. And in fact, finally he caves in and he just actually stops believing that there's a person on the other end of the line. But he tells himself, he holds out strong hope that she exists. He hopes he's wrong about this. And he says, you may not be real, but there's some slim possibility that you are. That's enough for me to think this is worth continuing. And so he does. He continues it. He plays along. He plays the game. He continues to do loving things. And then eventually they meet, finds out she's real. They marry. But again, there was a period of time where he was not believing. And someone says, when did your personal relationship begin? And Bob says, well, fun fact, back when I didn't even think she existed. And that doesn't seem like he says anything false to me. And so that strikes me as a case of loving personal relationships without belief.
Okay, now what might somebody say, the proponent of the hiddenness argument, what might they say in response to that kind of thought experiment?
Well, I think there's really only two. I think there's only really two responses. One is to say that's not really a loving personal relationship. I mean, I don't really have a response to that other than say read the story again. I don't know how to argue that it's a loving personal relationship, but insofar as I understand what a loving personal relationship, that sure as heck seems like one to me. And it's at least it seems like one enough to me that I'd be very doubtful of that premise, right? All it has to be for me is like close enough to the real deal that I think I should be highly skeptical of P4 or the assumption. I don't think I need rock solid proof that it's a loving personal relationship. I just need enough evidence that it is to undermine confidence in that claim. So that's one move. The other thing that someone could say is, well, that really is belief. And again, to that one, I'm not exactly sure what we mean by the word belief anymore. If you try to say, well, that really can't count, that really counts as a belief. I mean, he's saying, I don't believe this person exists. I don't believe there's anything there. Very, very adamant, cries himself to sleep at night because he thinks, this is probably all wasted time and effort because this person's not real. What is wrong with me? I mean, that kind of stuff, that looks like disbelief to me. There might be weaker things that you think it looks like, but it doesn't look like belief the way we talk about it in epistemology.
Okay. You give another example, the hallucination scenario. What's this one?
Yeah. There is one kind of belief state in the previous example that someone might ling on to. He's like, well, he believes there's something that he's interacting with. He believes there's something there, right? Like there's something out there. Maybe it's not Julie, but he does believe he's interacting with a thing. And so maybe that's enough of a belief. So I was trying to concoct another example where there was no something out there, right? And so the idea was, imagine someone gets evidence. I got this idea by watching A Beautiful Mind. Remember when he finds out at the end? Sorry, spoiler alert, but if you haven't seen Beautiful Mind,
I've seen it. Yeah, it's a good movie.
He finds out at the end that he's hallucinating some of his closest relationships, and I was like, "There's one. There's a personal relationship without belief." And so I just tried to twist it a little bit so that the person was real. So he gets evidence that he is hallucinating a lot of his close relationships, and there's some nurse that he falls in love with, and he realizes he's hallucinating these things. And again, same thing with the Turing chat, right? Stops believing that this person is real, doesn't believe there's anything out there in the world that he's interacting with. but yet does the same thing. Like, man, she's so great. If she were real, I'd feel really bad not continuing to do the things because she's so deserving of, what we have and blah, blah, blah. Fill in the story however you want with as many acts of loving kindness as you want. And again, there's no belief that the person is there. And I thought this one was importantly different because you're not even believing that there's something out there, right? You don't believe you're interacting with a computer or a robot. These are just figments of your imagination.
Yeah. So how might somebody respond to that example?
Well, I mean, the main responses would be similar to the first one. You'd have to be, resist that it's really a personal relationship, resist that it's a loving relationship, or resist that it is in some way, shape, or form a kind of belief. My responses would be the same as before. I just think I thought this one was a little stronger because at least I removed all external world objects from the equation. Now, there is something that someone could say on either of these that I actually got this from an anonymous referee on the paper. And they gave an interesting example involving fictional characters. So I suppose we could talk about that because that's sort of the next.
Yeah, I thought that was a neat example. So yeah, the fictional character objection. What is it?
So the fictional character objection goes something like this. You know, if you've ever read a novel where you feel like, boy, I think I'd be in love with that person, like Anna Karenina or something like that. Well, I'll just read what the anonymous referee said. They said, can you be in love with Anna Karenina while believing that she is merely a character in Tolstoy's novel? Can you be afraid of King Kong as he strides menacingly toward the camera while realizing that there is no danger because it's just a movie? Arguably not. People can have fantasies of love and of fear, but if you were really afraid of King Kong, would you stay in the cinema, right? And so the idea is like these aren't real emotions. They feel like love. They feel like fear, but you're not doing the things you would do normally. There's some part of you that deep down, these are sort of what the referee called counterfeit emotions. And so I guess that's basically a way to say this isn't a real loving personal relationship, because that loving we should put in scare quotes. It's a counterfeit kind of love. It's not real genuine love. It's sort of what I think the referee was going at. I thought that was a pretty good candidate objection.
Yeah. I want to hear the responses you go through in the paper. When I was reading it and I came across that objection before I read your responses, my immediate thought was, what seems to be lacking in that example is even hope. I can understand why somebody might say, I hope that someone like Anna Karenina is really
Yeah,
out there. That would
yeah,
be great. It's hard to think that somebody would take seriously,
yeah.
I hope that Anna Karenina herself is real.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, because as you read it, this is fiction. She is
Yeah.
not real. Perhaps there's a girl like
That's
her
a
out
good
there.
candidate response. Imagine you didn't know if this was a nonfiction biography or not. You didn't know, like it wasn't presented to you as a work of fiction, and you're
Mhm.
sort of like looking at it and you're like, oh man, I love this girl. Is this fiction or is this nonfiction? Right?
Mhm.
I'm really confused here. And you might think, in that state of epistemic uncertainty, it's not as weird to say you love Anna Karenina. Suppose you discover that it turned out that it was a work of nonfiction, and maybe you got to go meet her.
Mhm.
You might. It doesn't sound as weird to say that that's a counterfeit emotion, right?
Mhm.
It's like, look, Anna, I loved you even back when I wasn't sure if this was a fictional story about you or a nonfiction story, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound as crazy to me.
Mhm.
Um,
So, yeah, I guess walk us through your own responses to that kind of fictional character objection.
well, I mean, the main things are there are some important disanalogies there. One, our intuitions that this is quote unquote counterfeit might come from our belief that the thing is not real. In the case of loving personal relation, if you the belief that it's not real and the fact that they're not real, right? You might think that the emotion misfires, that you can't love something if it doesn't exist. And so the mere fact that it doesn't exist counts. But I mean, hypothetically, let's assume that we're in a world where God exists, right? If we're in a world where God exists, then it wouldn't be a misfire, right? If people are, in a relationship but kind of doubting or not sure God is real. So I think that's one important disanalogy. And the other important disanalogy is part of the reason you might think it's a counterfeit emotion. Notice the language the referee used. You're not doing the things you would do if you really loved someone. You're not doing the things you would do if you really feared. You're not running out of the theater. You're not like scouring the world trying to find out where Anna Karenina exists. You're not doing the things that you would do. But in the examples I gave, you are, right? You're doing that. You're doing the things that you would do if you loved someone, right? So again, the crux of the response is the two things that might push us to think these are counterfeit emotions in the Anna Karenina and King Kong case aren't present in the examples I give, right? We're presupposing that the person exists, so the emotion doesn't misfire, and the people are doing the things you would do if you genuinely were in love.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you mentioned that Schellenberg might try to argue for the first premise using a weaker claim. So what is that weaker claim first?
Yeah,
Go ahead and
yeah.
lay that out for us.
So I pinned a really strong thesis on Schellenberg when I was trying to construct his argument, that personal relationship argument. And it was that that God would do whatever necessary. Sorry. Let me back that up. So, suppose you think belief is not required for a personal relationship. So you buy the hallucination scenario as a counterexample. You might think that belief significantly increases the chances, right? So even if it's not required, it's a safe bet that if someone comes to believe in God, that they're more likely to form that personal relationship. So what you would do is you'd revise the argument and you'd say, okay, instead what's going to happen is God is going to, if God exists, God is going to maximize the probability that all human beings enter into a relationship with God, right? That's sort of the idea. And if God is going to maximize the probability that all humans, then he's going to give everybody sufficient evidence, right? Because that's the best way to kind of maximize the probability. So that was sort of the thought. That's a sort of more, maybe that's a slightly more charitable interpretation of what Schellenberg might have said, even though he used language like necessary, maybe just language of like highly likely.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, he might say, okay, fair points, Dr. Cullison. Maybe belief isn't required to have the personal relationship, but nevertheless, when you believe in the person, there's a better chance that you're going to form a personal relationship with them than if you don't believe.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the crux of it.
Okay. So then how do you respond to that weaker claim?
Well, the weaker claim is, so maybe God would do what I could concede that maybe God would do whatever would maximize the probability for the moment, although I'm going to reject that later, but let's just isolate that. Instead, I'm curious about the premise that he now needs, which is the revised P4. He's got to say something like, if there's a being who would maximize the probability that all humans believe, then he's going to give all humans sufficient evidence. So now there's a different assumption behind P4, which is the best way for each individual human to maximize the probability for them that they will believe in God is to give them sufficient evidence. And I'm not sure that's true, right? God could have reasons to create a world where people have different emotional makeups, different emotional psychologies. And you could imagine someone, the counterexample I use is imagine a guy named John, and we'll say he's pretty emotionally vulnerable, very afraid of rejection. And he might actually thrive in Turing Chat Room scenarios where he's more likely to engage in acts of loving kindness when he's like, good chance this person's not real, right? So there's that kind of distance. And I mean, we don't need to get into the weeds on this, but for all I know, God could have reason to create human beings with different emotional vulnerabilities. And maybe there are some people for which God creates them in a certain way, and God realizes, you know what? I've actually got a better chance at forming a loving personal relationship with this person if I do if I keep the hidden thing going, right? I give them hints, I give them subtle things, and maybe they're more likely to talk to me, to pray to me, or whatever, than if I were just this big, looming figure. And if God had reason to create different psychological makeups, maybe there are ways to maximize the probability that every human forms that relationship, and then he just meets each individual human where they are based on the. So it could be that God right now, if God exists, is maximizing the probability. Just for some of us, God knows a hands-off approach is a better way to do it.
Yeah. Now, as I read the paper, I guess I hadn't started applying the emotionally vulnerable counterexample to the way that God is interacting with us and setting things up and so forth.
Yeah, I didn't write
I
that
was
into the
thinking
paper.
of it maybe more generally of, hey, for Schellenberg's argument to work, he would need to dial back the claim, make it a weaker claim.
Yeah.
And that weaker claim is just like we said a moment ago, hey, maybe you're right, Dr. Cullison, that belief may not be required for personal relationship, but belief significantly increases the chances that a personal relationship will form. That claim, that belief significantly increases the chances that a personal relationship will form. It seems like we can think of plausible counterexamples to that, and that's the
It just depends
emotionally
on the
vulnerable
psychology of the individual,
guy.
right?
I wasn't, and maybe you're comfortable doing that. I don't know if I want to say, and that's the reason that God does it. It's just,
I'm not offering that as a reason. I'm not even, so it's not, I'm still in defense, not theodicy territory. So even when we go into talking about what motivations a God might have, I'm not saying that's the way it operates. I'm just saying, for all we know, that's the way it could be operative. And really what I'm doing is I wrote this paper a long time ago. I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me just map why I went with that. So you give the emotionally vulnerable counterexample. Look, some people psychologically just, that's not true of them. And then I can imagine Schellenberg saying, well, yeah, but why would God make people like that? Why not make people reasons responsive and more likely to form personal relationships if they have the evidence there, right? Why make these emotionally vulnerable people? And then I was sort of like, so I got ahead of myself, and then I went to, who the heck knows? Like, I don't know. I don't have to answer that. I don't have to have an answer for that. All I can say is, for all I know, God might have a good reason to bring some people into a relationship via explicit belief, but bring some other people into a relationship via an enormous amount of doubt. I don't know.
Is that the third revision of the argument that Schellenberg could make? He could start off with this claim like, okay, belief's required, but then say, no, weaker claim, belief just significantly increases the chances that a person
That's kind of where I was going. And in fact, that third version is sort of me anticipating his objection in a slightly different way. But yeah, so the third thing he could do is say, okay, fine. Isn't it just better to have a personal relationship with someone whom you believe exists? But both parties are believers. And I mean, the long and short of it is we are now getting into territory where I think our axiological, our value intuitions are a little murkier, right? When you said, surely like the best thing is to have a personal relationship with God, I'm like, yeah, I can be on board with that. But now we've gone into territory where what we're saying is, well, surely it's a personal relationship with explicit belief. I'm like, you can give me some motivation to think that's true, but I can think of all sorts of reasons why someone having a personal relationship with suspending judgment about the existence of the person also has significant value. You know, think of the chance John is taking on, Bob, sorry. Think of the chance Bob is taking on Julie, right? When he doesn't really believe. I mean, man, what a stand-up guy. Like he's not even sure this person is real. And yet he's willing to make all these sacrifices. He's willing to do all these things, all the while just plagued with doubt. I mean, man, that seems like a really, really loving kind of person, right? With those no guarantees. So, in fact, that is what inspired the second response. My responding to that HS suspension of judgment is partially what inspired the second response. I think you can kind of see the parallels there. Like, wow, there's something pretty remarkable about a guy like Bob going through with all this stuff, not sure that Julie's real.
Okay, so I guess now's a good time to turn to the second response that you give in the paper. Are you cool with that?
Yeah.
Okay, which is good because we're at the 30-minute mark and I'd planned to go an hour, so about halfway point. All right, so everything we've said up to this point, maybe somebody's watching and they're like, all that is stupid. Forget all that. You have a totally different type of response to Schellenberg's argument, and we're going to look at that now. So yeah, what's the second response?
So the second response, I'll just note, the thing I like about the second response is I actually got the idea by reading a fantastic book by a non-theist philosopher of religion, Eric Wielenberg, called Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe. And the crux of that is there's all these moral arguments for God's existence that all have the following form. If God doesn't exist, bad normative stuff happens. Like if God doesn't exist, there's no meaning of life. If God doesn't exist, there's no ground for morality, right? They all fit that kind of pattern. And he basically goes through and does a takedown of each one of those. But one of them, in that, something he noted that I thought was super interesting is he had this idea that, you know what? All these arguments are of the form that if God exists, doesn't exist, then certain kinds of great goods aren't possible. And he's like, here's a good, a really great good that is only possible if God doesn't exist. And that's the ability to make truly, genuinely heroic sacrifices. And so here's the way he goes. He says, okay, imagine a Christian theist who believes in God and is, very confident of, the afterlife and salvation and all that stuff. And that Christian, sacrifices their life for another person. Wielenberg's point is like, what the heck kind of sacrifice is that? You're not giving anything up. In fact, if anything, you're accelerating your path to the really good place, right? Like it's, it's almost like there's incentive to do that, because if the other place is way better, why not just find someone to sacrifice your life for now and then get to the party? I don't say it that way in the paper. I'm just saying that colloquially here. But then he said, but now imagine someone is a naturalist. They think death is the end of all conscious existence. Man, they're giving up a lot, right? You fall on a grenade and you think that's the end of it. So he thinks the naturalist ought to view themselves, the naturalist who's serious about ethics and living a good life, they ought to view themselves as a kind of hero, right? Like, they're going to do things. They're going to make sacrifices knowing that there's no payoff. There's nothing. There's nothing at the end of this, right? And I thought, boy, that's a really, really good point when I first read it. And then I thought, wait a minute, naturalism doesn't need to be true. The metaphysical thesis that there's no afterlife, that there is no God, doesn't need to be true. The epistemic uncertainty is the thing that needs to be there, right? So you don't need it to be false that God exists. in order to be the naturalist hero. You don't need it to be false that there's an afterlife and there's a big party that we all go to. All you need is that there's a lot of reason to doubt it, right? There's like that all the risks you're taking on behalf of your God could be for naught, right? And that is something that's a really great good that's only possible if God hides. And so what I basically did is, the thing I like about this response is I took Wielenberg's purely non-theistic intuitions about value, and I said, well, wait a minute, we don't need full-blown naturalism to be true. If you lived in a world where God existed and God hid, didn't make his or her presence obvious, then you've got all the conditions you need to enable those really great goods. So this is a version of the greater good defense. This goes after the first premise, that the greatest good is one where people have the opportunity. People live in a world where they have an opportunity to exhibit the greatest form of love, right? And in fact, this should fit well with Christians, right? Didn't Jesus say something like, the greatest form of love is to lay down your life for your neighbor? Like, that's the greatest act, right? So if that's the greatest act of love, well, the only way for that to really be a great act of love is in a theistic world where Christianity is true, is if for that person there's a high degree of uncertainty about whether or not things are going to go well after the death.
Yeah, I found that a super interesting response. And so just to give people a sense of where we've gone at this point in the interview, the first half of the interview focused on inspecting P4. And you gave some examples like, it seems like we got some good reasons to doubt P4. Now you're giving a response that goes after P1. And yeah, so I take it this response is basically like, there's a really great good that is only possible if God hides. And it's not just a really great good. For Christians, perhaps it's, that's an interesting question. So perhaps it's the greatest good. Obviously, Jesus says to love God and love your neighbor. That's the greatest commandment that we ought to keep. But I guess very closely related to that is like, what greater love is this than to lay down your life for your friends? So it's like the greatest way that I can love my neighbor is to lay down my life. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought. It's an interesting thought for sure. Okay, now how other people have developed responses in the same that are similar. Michael Murray, Richard Swinburne, maybe mention like what their response is and what's similar about it, but I want you to emphasize how the response you're offering is different than theirs.
Yeah. So the response you just mentioned gives a kind of, it's actually very similar to free will defenses against the problem of evil. Roughly the idea is, if God were, like buddy Jesus from Dogma, where he's like hanging out with us all the time, right? You would always feel pressure to do the right thing, so much so that it would be kind of like you'd be under duress, right? It's like, it's like the way you behave when your parents are around and the way you behave when you're not, right? You're not really freely behaving. You're only behaving that way because you don't want to get punished. Like, if you could really do whatever you wanted to do, you'd be behaving differently. And so that's sort of the idea. So the idea is that now people can do good for good's sake, right? Like, that's the only motive or incentive they have. And Schellenberg is just sort of skeptical. I think the crux of Schellenberg's response is he's skeptical that kind of duress is really there, right? Like, there could be, he seems to think it would still be possible for someone to act for pure motives, even though the strong incentive to act is good. So he thinks it would still be possible for someone to be doing, imagine buddy Jesus is in the room with two people. He thinks there's somebody in that room who might, just be doing it because God is there. And he's like, but there could be people who are really, really pure in their motives, and they are capable of acting on pure motives, even though the strong incentive is in the room. That was kind of his way of resisting. And
Let me
now
pause you
I
there
think,
really quick. So just to be clear, Michael Murray and Richard Swinburne, the kind of responses that they give to hiddenness, or at least one response, I guess, that they've given to hiddenness is that, hey, your free will seems to be undermined in some sense
yeah,
if God is very obvious.
yeah, exactly. It's like
Right.
God's got a gun to your head, basically, right?
Okay.
All the
Because now
time.
you're not just doing the good for good's sake.
Yeah.
You're doing it to get goodies for yourself or something like that.
Exactly. Or
It
to not
undermines
be
your
thrown into
motivation.
bad place or something, or whatever your beliefs are in that situation. Yeah. So that's their response, and but Schellenberg thinks no, like people can still act on pure motives even with a gun to their head, I suppose. And so what I think is importantly different about this response is, I don't think he can say that there. I don't think he can say people can genuinely lay down their lives sacrificially while knowing it's all going to turn out okay. Like I just that just bruises the eardrums to even say that. I'm not exactly sure how that would work. So I think it sidesteps a response that Schellenberg could give.
Okay. So we're getting close to the end here. You apply this response to a text that a lot of people have wondered about. I've wondered about exactly how, what does this mean? How should I interpret this? And that's Matthew 27:46. There Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So he's hanging on the cross and he says this. Now, how does this response maybe illuminate what Jesus might mean in that passage?
Yeah, good. And it might help to give a little backstory on another puzzle in the Christian tradition. This is a puzzle that any Christian, I think, needs to grapple with, which is there are all these passages in the Bible, the Christian Bible, that seem to suggest that Jesus lacked knowledge, right? There's passages that say when he was younger, then he grew in knowledge. Well, wait a minute. If he's God incarnate, how can he grow in knowledge, right? There's passages where Jesus says things like, "Who touched me?" It's like, well, wait a minute. Like, don't you know who touched you, right? Like, if you're an omniscient deity, and that literature, a lot of people who are writing in that space interpret this as a kind of confession of Jesus, basically saying God's hidden. They're basically saying God's hidden from me, because if you go back to the original psalm that he's quoting, my God, why have you forsaken me?" There's a psalm that starts out that way, and it's that psalm is. The thing I love about the Psalms is they're actually pretty raw. I mean, those are where people are like actively complain. Their prayers like complain to God about God's behavior, right? Like these are very brazen kinds of songs, so to speak. And one interpretation of that one is someone is basically complaining about God's hiddenness, right? They're saying, "Why are you not present?" Right? And I sometimes read those as sort of quasi confessions of doubting that you're even real, right? That's my reading of that psalm. And there's even there's interpretations of that passage that like God temporarily turned his face on, and there was, so we're to believe at least one interpretation of that is there's a moment where Jesus for the first time felt the hiddenness, right? And so you might think that one possible way the whole story could go. Again, I'm just saying this is a possible way. I'm offering up a logical possibility about how atonement might work, about what would be required of God to make it work. This is just a possible option. I'm not saying this is the way it is, but here's a possible option. Let's say that in order for atonement to work, God has to come down and do the things that we ourselves are not capable of doing, including being perfectly loving, right? And one way to be perfectly loving is to, Jesus kind of foreshadows it, right? Lay down your life, right? Now, if it's Jesus being genuinely sacrificial, everything I said about genuine sacrifice, then you might think for atonement to work, God has to do something when God comes down to sort of put some temporary blinders up, right? God has to go through a moment where, for a moment, even for God, it has to seem like maybe this is a waste. Like maybe I shouldn't go through this cross thing, right? Like maybe I should just set myself free, like the people are saying, and just rule the world here, right? And so it you might think it can't be that great act of love unless there's temporary hiddenness, and then that would explain the passage, right? Like that's what happened. Like in that moment, one possible explanation for what's going on is that's the moment when the hiddenness was experienced in order to make the sacrifice the genuine sacrifice that requires the epistemic uncertainty. That's sort of
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thought. I don't know if it's correct, but it's worth thinking about.
Doesn't
Yeah.
have to be. That's the beautiful thing about a defense. You just need to construct a logically possible way that the Christian story could go that's not inconsistent with core truths and claims of Christianity, and you got yourself a.
All right. So I have one more question. I didn't send this one to you in advance, and then we'll wrap up. Here's a thought. Going back to the first response you gave about belief not being required to have personal relationship with God. What do you think in terms of what might the implications of that be for someone's salvation? So like, could it be the case that someone has saving faith in God? They'll experience salvation, even though they don't believe in him, but nevertheless, they have relationship with him because I guess on your account, at minimum, they have hope. Yeah. So
Yep.
I guess take that any way you want.
Yeah. So here's what I think. There's actually some precedent for this in other passages in the Bible. So I like one of the things I really the passage I like to puzzle over is when Paul says, "Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief." Right? And I'm like, what is going on there? And I've talked with some of the philosophers who are even mentioned in this paper, and we've been talking about, and they're thinking that the concept of belief as we use it right now in ordinary everyday English is a very strong, like, you actively entertain the proposition, is God real? And internally your head is saying, yes, this is real, right? Something like that. But there are belief-like states. Howard Snyder uses the phrase accepting, right? Where you might not be able to bring yourself to believe something, but you're like, you know what? I'm just going to treat it as if it's true, as a way to guide my life, right? And we can do this in non-religious cases, right? You might, let's see. There might be a lot of evidence that your friend is guilty of something, and you're like, oh, this is all pointing in the bad direction. But you know what? Until we get more, I'm going to accept that you're not guilty. Now, there's part of you that's like, I don't know. But if you accept it, then you just say, so I'm going to go about and do things like, I'm not going to report you to the police right now. I'm not going to lock you up. I'm not going to, right? I'm going to have a little bit of trust that something's going to pan out and that this evidence is going to be contradicted, right? So there's belief-like states. So, and I think something like hope, right? Like could count as that as well, right? Like I can't force myself to have a belief, right? To be honest, I don't think we have a whole lot of control over our beliefs, in the strong sense, right? But we do have control over what we hope for, uh, what hopes we're going to align our behaviors around, and so, yeah, I think the implication is that we we ought to be open to the possibility that salvation can come, but it doesn't need to come from the strong belief that I think our Western American use of that term means. I think there's a whole variety of messy mental states that look very belief-like, and I think it's a real good question that we should ask ourselves. Like when Paul said, "Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief." Uh, Maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room for how much confidence needs to be there. And to be honest, I think it would be pretty healthy to explore that as a possibility for Christians, because um, doubt is very, very stigmatized in contemporary Christianity. And I think we'd be better off getting away from that. I think if people think that I can't be a Christian unless I have this firm, confident belief in the metaphysical reality of what the Christian story is, um, I mean, as soon as they start to have doubts, then they're like, well, I can't be a Christian now, right?
Mm.
But if it's possible to have loving personal relationships on the hope, right? If it's sort of like, look, I can't bring myself to think this is real, but it sure as heck is the one that I would like to be real, and I'm ready to align my life in this way. Um, you mentioned Pascal's wager earlier on, right? These are the Pascal's wager folks. Like I literally can't give myself that super confident thing that for some reason contemporary Christians often seem to think is necessary. But I can do this other thing, and I can go through the motions in my doubts and really try to hope and pray that I get there. I think people would have healthier faiths, um, and uh, be a little bit more vigilant. And I mean, come on, hope is one of the three virtues, right? Like surely, like it doesn't say faith, belief, and love, right? It says faith, hope, and love. And we can get into faith too. I don't even think faith
Mm.
has to be a belief state either. Um, so yeah, none of those virtues
There's a
clearly
lot of
have that.
overlap.
None of those three virtues, faith, hope, and love, clearly have the sense of belief that I think contemporary American Christians would think that word means. So there's some
Mhm.
wiggle room there.
There's a lot of overlap there in what you said with a particular interview that I did last week, I think, with Liz Jackson. She has this really interesting paper on faith, belief, and hope, and how each of those attitudes can make acceptance of a proposition rational so that you stay committed to it over the long term. It's an interesting interview, and I think it has implications on uh, the kinds of things we were just discussing. I hope at some point I'll do an interview maybe where we look at like saving faith and like what different models of that might be. I'm aware of Daniel Howard Snyder's view that faith doesn't require belief. Maybe I can get him or someone else on to talk about that. But yeah, it'd be interesting. Okay. So to wrap up, if someone asked you, if they're like, hey, I've only got 60 seconds, but I've been reading some Schellenberg and his argument from hiddenness has me really, thinking God doesn't exist. What might you say in 60 seconds as a response?
Yep. 60 seconds. Okay. There's two crucial assumptions in the hiddenness argument that you should reject. One is that personal relationships require belief in the person. Lots of good examples where that's just not true. Um, you could be hallucinating someone and doubt their existence, but still be in a loving personal relationship with them, but not believe they exist. The other assumption is that there's no possible great good that God might have to hide. And I think there are very good reasons that God might have to hide if God exists. One is if God is hidden, he allows for the greatest possible sacrifice. When someone lays down their life for someone they love and they think that it's not likely that God exists or that there's a good chance God doesn't exist, they're giving up a lot. But someone who is super confident that God exists because they're hanging out with God all the time, they aren't able to make those real great acts of sacrificial love. So it allows for one of the greatest goods I think a human can participate in if God's hidden.
That was a really good summary. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cullison, for coming on. I've really enjoyed the conversation. And I'll
Appreciate it,
mention this for the viewer again. His paper, 2 Solutions to the Problem of Divine Hiddenness. I will have it linked in the description of this video. So if you want to read more, go more in depth, go check it out. And go check out that interview I mentioned with Daniel Speak on the Problem of Divine Hiddenness, and go check out that interview with Liz Jackson on faith, belief, and hope. All right. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.